25 piastres. That was the precise market value of a human head in the spring of 1809. It was not a ransom. It was a receipt. In the chaotic fringe of the Ottoman Empire, a soldier could trade a severed head for a pouch of silver coins, provided the merchandise was fresh. But the exchange required more than just the blade of a sword. It required a process that history often sanitizes, a procedure so clinical it turns the stomach far more than the heat of battle. Before the reward could be claimed, the identity had to be separated from the structure. Picture the scene. The dust settles on the battlefield. The living sit among the dead, not to mourn, but to work. They take out their knives, sharp and cold, and begin the taxidermy of terror. The skin of the face is peeled back from the bone, slowly, carefully, ensuring the features remain intact. This flesh, this mask of humanity, is then stuffed with cotton and straw, stitched back together with the precision of a tailor making a winter coat. These grotesque dolls, retaining the expressions of their final agony, were packed into crates and shipped to Istanbul to amuse the Sultan. But the bone remained. The naked, white calcium of the skull was left behind, because deep down, beneath our civilized veneer, we recognize a primal, terrifying truth. We are not just souls. To a tyrant, we are simply bricks. If you travel today to the city of Niš in modern-day Serbia, you will find the evidence of this architectural madness standing by the roadside. It rises from the earth like a finger accusing the sky. At a distance, it appears to be nothing more than a rectangular pillar of mud and stone, crumbling under the weight of 2 centuries. The wind blows across the plains, kicking up dust that coats the surface in a uniform gray. But you must walk closer. You must step into the shadow of the monument until you can smell the dampness of the old mortar. Look at the texture of the wall. Those are not stones. Embedded in the sand and lime, arranged in perfect horizontal rows, like books on a shelf, are human skulls. Originally, there were 952 of them, 14 rows on each of the 4 sides, 952 pairs of empty sockets staring blindly out at the fields where they once tended crops and raised children. This is the Skull Tower. The locals call it Cele Kula. It is arguably the most horrific monument ever constructed, not because of the number of dead, but because of the intent. It was not built to hide the massacre. It was built to broadcast it. It was designed by the Ottoman general Hurshid Pasha to serve as a permanent billboard of intimidation, a lighthouse of bone, warning anyone who dared to dream of independence. But before the mortar hardened, before the flies gathered on the fresh lime, there was a man named Stevan Sinđelić, and a choice that would crack the foundation of an empire. He did not look like a monument then. He looked like a man who had forgotten the taste of water. Standing knee-deep in the churning mud of the Cegar hill trench, Stevan Sinđelić was not a marble statue staring boldly into the future. He was an exhausted commander, staring into the abyss. The air around him was thick, not just with the humidity of late May, but with the metallic tang of fear and the sulfurous bite of black powder. It was the 31st of May, 1809, a day that would begin with prayers and end in an apocalypse. To understand the tower, you must first understand the trench. It was a narrow scar cut into the Serbian earth, a claustrophobic corridor where 3,000 men huddled, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for a storm that had a name. That storm was the Ottoman army, a force that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Stevan wiped the sweat from his eyes, leaving a streak of grime across his forehead. His hands, rough and calloused from years of farming before they ever held a weapon, were trembling slightly. Not from cowardice, but from the adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins for days. He gripped his flintlock pistol, the heavy iron mechanism cold and reassuring against his palm. It was a clumsy weapon by modern standards, prone to misfire, requiring a calm hand to load the powder and the ball. But in that moment, it was the only anchor he had left in a world tilting toward destruction. The sounds of the enemy were not yet the screams of combat, but something worse. The rhythmic, terrifying thrum of thousands of boots marching in unison. It was a low-frequency vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the soles of his boots, shaking the very dirt walls that protected him. He looked at his men. These were not professional soldiers trained in academies. They were farmers, shepherds, fathers, and sons who had traded their plows for muskets to join the first Serbian uprising. He saw the terror in the eyes of a young boy from Mrasava, clutching a musket that looked too big for his arms. He saw the grim resignation in the face of his lieutenant. They all looked to him for a miracle. But Stevan knew the logistics of war better than anyone. He knew that the promised reinforcements were not coming. He knew that the political squabbles and petty jealousies of the other commanders had left him isolated on this hill, a sacrificial lamb offered up to the empire. He turned his gaze away from the horizon and looked down at the center of the trench. There, stacked like barrels of wine in a cellar, were the kegs of gunpowder. They sat innocuously in the mud, wooden staves bound with iron hoops. Most commanders kept their powder reserves deep in the rear, protected and safe. Stevan had ordered them brought forward, placed right in the heart of the command post. At the time, his men thought it was for easy access during the reload. Only Stevan knew the true purpose of that arrangement. He ran his thumb over the flint of his pistol, feeling the sharp edge of the stone. He was calculating the distance. He was calculating the time. He was realizing that the only thing standing between his men and the skinning knives of the enemy was not victory, but the choice of how they would die. And here lies the paradox that history books struggle to contain. To save his soldiers from the Ottoman knives, Sinđelić had to become their executioner. He had to make a unilateral decision for 3,000 souls who were still fighting, still praying, still believing they might see another sunrise. He did not call a council. He did not ask for a vote. He simply watched the enemy lines tighten like a noose and accepted the terrible arithmetic of mercy. Surrender meant the slow flaying of skin, the agony of the stake, a death that would last for days. The gunpowder meant oblivion in the blink of an eye. But was it his right to choose? As he stood there, watching the impending wave of Turkish infantry, he became the judge, jury, and executioner of his own army. Now, I want you to place yourself in those mud-soaked boots. Feel the weight of the iron pistol in your hand. It is heavy, isn't it? Heavier than any weapon should be. Look at the faces of the men around you. Look at your brother. Look at your son. Ask yourself the question that has haunted the winds of Niche for 2 centuries. If you pull that trigger, you are a mass murderer. If you do not, you are an accomplice to their torture. So tell me, in this moment of absolute darkness, is Stevan Sinđelić a guardian angel, delivering his flock from evil? Or is he a monster born of desperation? The fuse is lit. The verdict is yours. To understand the weight of that pistol in Stevan's hand, you cannot look only at the mud of the trench. You must look back through the fog of time, through 5 long centuries of silence. For 500 years, the land of Serbia had been swallowed whole by the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. It was a darkness that covered everything, from the valleys of the Danube to the peaks of the Balkan mountains. In the eyes of the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, the Serbs were not citizens. They were raya, the flock, a source of tax revenue and labor, stripped of their sovereignty and their dignity. Generations were born, grew old, and died without ever knowing what it meant to walk with their heads held high. The church bells were silenced. The swords were confiscated. The history of a kingdom was slowly being erased, rewritten by the conquerors in the flowing script of the Ottoman court. But memory is a stubborn thing. It hides in the songs sung by the hearthfire. It survives in the stories whispered from grandfather to grandson when the windows are shuttered against the cold winter night. In 1804, that whisper became a roar. It started not with an army, but with a spark in the village of Orašac. It was led by a man named Karađorđe, Black George, a tempest of a human being, who decided that it was better to die on his feet than live on his knees. The first Serbian uprising was not merely a rebellion. It was an eruption. It was the collective scream of a people who had been suffocated for half a millennium. Farmers hammered their sides into swords. They took old hunting rifles from beneath the floorboards. They marched not for conquest, but for the simple, radical idea that they owned their own lives. By the spring of 1809, that fire had spread to the southern frontier, to the strategic city of Niš. This was the gateway to Istanbul, the key to the empire's hold on the Balkans. Stevan Sinđelić was one of the flames in this firestorm. He was a voivoda, a duke, a title that commanded respect not because of noble blood, but because of the blood he had spilled for the cause. He and his men believed that the tide had turned. They believed that the great powers of Europe might look down and aid their Christian brothers. They were drunk on the wine of liberty, intoxicated by a few years of victories. But hope is a fragile armor against the machinery of an empire. While the Serbs celebrated their newfound freedom, the empire was waking up. The Ottoman giant, stung and humiliated, began to mobilize its vast resources. They did not send a police force to quell a riot. They sent an extermination force. From the east, a massive army began to move, an endless river of soldiers, cavalry, and artillery. They brought with them not just weapons, but the intent to restore order through absolute terror. The Serbs at Cegar were not facing a rival nation. They were facing the wrath of a wounded superpower that intended to make an example of them. An example that would be written in bone. The stage for this final act was a hill called Cegar, a nondescript rise in the topography north of Niš that would soon become the altar of a nation. In the days leading up to the slaughter, the hill was transformed into a hive of desperate activity. The Serbs did not have the time or the resources to build stone walls. They had only the earth beneath their feet and the strength in their backs. They dug into the clay and the limestone, carving out 6 defensive trenches arranged in a rough formation. It was back-breaking work. You can imagine the sound of iron pickaxes striking rock, a rhythmic percussion that echoed from dawn until dusk. Hands that had once sowed wheat were now blistered and bloody from shaping parapets of mud and reinforcing them with wooden palisades. These were not the impenetrable bastions of medieval fantasy. They were fragile scars on the landscape, pitifully small against the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Inside these earthen walls, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of piety and panic. Orthodox priests moved among the men, their black robes trailing in the dust, swinging censers of frankincense to bless the cannons and the souls of those who would man them. The air was thick with the murmur of the Lord's Prayer, recited over and over until the words lost their meaning and became a meditative drone. But beneath the prayers, there was a cold, hard reality. Stevan Sinđelić had roughly 3,000 men under his direct command in the main trench. Against them, the Ottoman commander Hurshid Pasha had mobilized a force estimated at nearly 40,000. The disparity was not just a military disadvantage, it was a mathematical impossibility. As the Ottoman vanguard crested the surrounding ridges, the horizon itself seemed to change color. It shifted from the green of the spring grass to the red of the fezzes and the white of the turbans. The ground began to tremble, not metaphorically, but literally, under the hooves of thousands of cavalry horses. The Serbs looked out from their mud holes and saw an ocean of steel and cloth flooding the valley. They saw the glint of the curved scimitars and the long barrels of the muskets. They saw the heavy artillery pieces, the lumbering beasts of war that would soon turn their fragile earthworks into dust. For the men in the trench, the world shrank down to the few feet of dirt in front of them. The vast political ambitions of the uprising, the dreams of a free Serbia, the complex geopolitical chess game between Russia and the Porte, all of it evaporated. All that remained was the heat of the sun, the dryness in their throats, and the terrifying knowledge that they were trapped. There was no water to wash away the fear. There was no shade to hide from the glare of history. They were 3,000 islands in a rising sea, and the tide was coming in with a roar that would drown out every prayer they had ever whispered. At the center of this storm sat a man who viewed the slaughter not as a passion, but as a ledger. Hurshid Pasha was the Grand Vizier of the Rumelia Eyalet, a title that carried the weight of the Sultan's authority and the cold steel of the empire's will. While Sinđelić was sweating in the mud, commanding men with desperate shouts, Hurshid Pasha observed the battlefield from the comfort of a silk pavilion, likely sipping coffee while studying a map. He was not a barbarian screaming for blood. He was something far more dangerous. He was a bureaucrat of death, an administrator who understood that the most effective weapon of war was not the cannon, but the incentive. To Hurshid, the Serbian uprising was not a romantic struggle for freedom. It was a clerical error. It was a disruption in the flow of taxes, a breach of the peace that required a correction. And his method of correction was terrifyingly economic. He understood the base motivations of his own diverse army, an army composed not just of disciplined janissaries, but of mercenaries, irregulars, and conscripts from across the Orient. Loyalty was expensive, but greed was cheap. So he instituted a simple, brutal payroll system. He placed a bounty on the head of every Serbian rebel. 25 piastres. This transformed the battlefield. It turned every soldier under his command into a hunter, and every Serbian defender into walking currency. The Ottoman troops were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting for their wages. A head brought back to the commander's tent was proof of work done. It was a receipt. This policy stripped the war of any lingering chivalry. It meant that a wounded Serb would not be taken prisoner. He would not be ransomed. He would be harvested. Hurshid Pasha sat in his tent, listening to the distant roar of the cannons, knowing that his financial incentives were driving his men into a frenzy that no ideological speech could ever match. He was efficient. He was logical. And he was about to prove that the pen of a ruthless administrator is mightier and crueler than the sword. Yet, as the Ottoman noose tightened, the cruelest cut came not from the scimitars of the enemy, but from the silence of friends. Stevan Sinđelić was not the only commander in the region. A few miles away, safely positioned beyond the immediate reach of the Turkish guns, sat the main body of the Serbian army. They were led by Miloje Petrović, a man whose rank was equal to Stevan's, but whose spirit was consumed by a corrosive envy. In the high command of the uprising, egos were often as volatile as the gunpowder they carried. Miloje viewed Stevan not as a brother in arms, but as a rival for glory, a competitor for the praise of cathedral. As the bombardment of Čegar began, the ground shook with a violence that could be felt for miles. The smoke from the Turkish batteries rose into the sky like a black pillar, clearly visible to the reserve forces. Stevan's messengers rode out, horses foaming at the mouth, galloping through the hail of bullets to beg for reinforcements. They reached Miloje's camp with desperation in their eyes, pleading for cavalry, for infantry, for anything to relieve the pressure on the crumbling trenches. But Miloje Petrović did not give the order to march. He stood his ground, arms crossed, watching the distant plume of smoke with a cold, calculated indifference. He claimed it was a tactical decision, a need to hold the reserve line, but every soldier knew the truth. He was letting his rival bleed. Back in the trench, the realization hit Sinđelić harder than any physical blow. He climbed the parapet, ignoring the whizzing musket balls, and looked toward the Serbian lines. He expected to see the dust of approaching cavalry, the banners of his countrymen riding to the rescue. Instead, he saw only the empty, shimmering heat of the plain. The stillness of his allies was deafening. It was a betrayal that turned the battle from a desperate defense into a solitary martyrdom. He understood then that he was not fighting a war. He was fighting a funeral action. The isolation was absolute. The bitterness of that abandonment must have tasted like ash in his mouth. He was not going to die because the enemy was too strong. He was going to die because his own side was too broken. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the vast Ottoman host, preparing for the final assault, Stevan turned his back on the hope of rescue and faced the inevitability of the end. The time for hope had passed. The time for blood had arrived. It began not with a single shot, but with a movement so vast it looked like the landscape itself was shifting. The Ottoman lines surged forward, a tidal wave of red and white crashing against the fragile brown island of the Serbian trench. The initial volley of musket fire was blinding, a wall of white smoke that instantly obscured the sun, turning the bright afternoon into a choking gray twilight. The smell of sulfur filled the lungs, sharp and burning, masking the scent of the damp earth. For a few minutes, the discipline of the Serbian defenders held. They fired in volleys, reloading their flintlocks with frantic precision, tearing gaps in the approaching wall of humanity. But for every Turkish soldier that fell, 2 more stepped over his body, driven by the commands of their officers and the promise of the silver coins waiting in the commander's tent. The distance closed. The abstract horror of artillery bombardment gave way to the intimate brutality of hand-to-hand combat. The trenches, designed to protect the defenders, suddenly became their cages. The Ottoman infantry, the elite irregulars, swarmed up the earthen walls, clawing their way over the wooden palisades. They climbed over the piles of their own dead to get at the living. The fighting dissolved into a chaotic, screaming melee, where reloading a weapon was impossible. Men discarded their muskets and drew their yatagans, the curved short swords favored by the Balkan infantry. The battle became a series of personal, desperate struggles fought in the mud. It was the sound of steel striking bone, the grunt of exertion, the terrible intimacy of killing a man who is close enough to look you in the eye. Stevan Sinđelić stood in the center of this maelstrom. His uniform was torn, his face blackened by powder burns. He fired his pistols until they were empty, then used them as clubs. He saw his defensive lines crumbling under the sheer weight of numbers. The trench was filling up, literally filling up, with the bodies of the attackers and the defenders, inextricably tangled in death. The enemy was no longer over there. They were here. They were inside the perimeter. The flag of the uprising was wavering. The shouts of Allah and the cries for Serbia merged into a single, deafening dissonance. What is terrifying about the Battle of Čegar is not just the violence, but the density of it. Historians estimate that in those final moments, thousands of men were packed into a space meant for hundreds. It was a crushing press of flesh and iron. There was no room to swing a sword. Men were suffocated by the press of the crowd before they could even be struck down. And through the smoke, Stevan saw the final wave approaching. The trench was breached in a dozen places. The Ottoman soldiers were pouring in like water through a broken dam, their eyes wild with the frenzy of the kill. They were not just soldiers anymore. They were reapers, and the harvest was bountiful. The end was not coming. It was already standing next to him. And then, for Stevan Sinđelić, the world seemed to stop. The cacophony of dying men, the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded. It all blurred into a single dull roar, like the sound of an ocean heard from deep underwater. Time, which had been racing forward at the speed of a galloping horse, suddenly reined in. In this moment of suspended reality, his vision narrowed. The peripheral chaos faded into a gray vignette, leaving only the center of the trench in sharp, hyper-real focus. He looked at the faces of his soldiers. They were no longer fighting. They were drowning in the human tide. He saw a young lieutenant, his chest heaving, look back at him. In that split second of eye contact, there was no plea for help. There was only a silent, terrifying understanding. They both knew that the currency of hope had been spent. Stevan turned his gaze downward. There they sat, the wooden barrels of gunpowder. They looked almost peaceful amidst the carnage, the dark oak staves bound by rusted iron hoops. They were the only things in the trench that were not bleeding. He felt the weight of the pistol in his right hand. It was slippery with sweat and grime. He raised it slowly, the movement feeling heavy, as if he were lifting the weight of the entire uprising. His thumb found the hammer of the flintlock mechanism. He pulled it back. The sound was tiny, mechanical, insignificant against the backdrop of war. Yet it was the loudest sound in the universe. He was not just aiming at a barrel of explosives. He was aiming at history. He was aiming at the future of every Serbian child who would be born in chains. He looked at the Ottoman soldiers who were now just feet away, their eyes wide with the anticipation of the kill, completely unaware that they were standing on the precipice of oblivion. Stevan did not scream. He did not deliver a final speech. There was no need for words when the end was written in fire. He took one last breath, filling his lungs with the acrid, smoky air of his homeland. He looked at the open bung of the nearest keg, where the black grains of powder glistened like dark sand. He steadied his hand. He squeezed the trigger. There was no sound at first, only light, a blinding, searing whiteness that erased the mud, the blood, and the sky. For a fraction of a second sun was born on the hill of Cegar, a sphere of pure energy that was hotter than the forge of any blacksmith. The spark had found the powder, and the physics of destruction took over. The wooden barrels disintegrated instantly. The black grains of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal converted their solid mass into expanding gas with a violence that the human mind struggles to comprehend. It was a force that did not discriminate. It did not care about uniforms or religions or the desperate prayers whispered in the final moments. It simply expanded, pushing the world away with the hand of a furious God. Then came the shockwave. It moved through the trench like a physical wall, a hammer of compressed air that shattered bone and ruptured organs before the brain could even register the pain. The wooden palisades, which the men had labored so hard to build, were turned into shrapnel, splintering into thousands of jagged spears that flew in every direction. Stevan Sinđelić, the man who had pulled the trigger, was unmade. He, along with the thousands of Ottoman soldiers who had been rushing toward him with their swords raised, were instantly vaporized or torn apart, their bodies fused together in a grotesque embrace of death. The explosion punched a hole in the atmosphere. It threw tons of earth and rock into the air, creating a mushroom cloud of debris that rose high above the battlefield, casting a sudden, unnatural shadow over the valley of Niš. When the sound finally arrived, it was not a bang. It was a crack in the fabric of the world, a roar so loud it ruptured the eardrums of men standing miles away. The ground rolled like the deck of a ship in a storm. Horses in the distant Ottoman camp reared and bolted, terrified by the thunder that came from the earth instead of the clouds. And then, gravity reasserted its hold. The debris began to fall. A rain of dirt, stones, and broken bodies clattered back down into the smoking crater where the trench had been. The screams were gone. The battle cries were extinguished. In their place was a profound, ringing silence, a tinnitus that screamed in the ears of the survivors, masking the world in a dull, muffled quiet. The smoke hung low over the hill, a thick, acrid shroud that smelled of burnt meat and sulfur. The black sun had set, and what remained in the crater was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. But the silence did not last. As the smoke drifted away, a different kind of industry began to stir in the crater. The surviving Ottoman soldiers, those who had been far enough away to escape the blast, but close enough to witness it, shook off the dust and descended into the charnel house. They were not looking for survivors to save. They were looking for currency. Remember the price? 25 piastres. The explosion had shattered bodies, but it had not destroyed the economy of the battlefield. The ledger of Hurshid Pasha was still open, and payment was due. What followed was a scene that defies the romanticism of war. It was a harvest. Soldiers moved through the wreckage like scavengers, turning over charred limbs and sifting through the bloody mud. When they found a Serbian corpse that was relatively intact, they did not offer a prayer. They drew their knives. The work was swift and practiced. They grabbed the hair, pulled the head back to expose the neck, and sawed through muscle and cartilage until the prize came loose. The heads were collected in sacks, heavy and dripping, and dragged back to the Ottoman camp like bushels of grotesque fruit. But the horror did not end with decapitation. That was merely the acquisition of raw materials. The processing was yet to come. In the shadow of the commander's tent, a field workshop was established. This is where the true nightmare of Niš unfolded. The heads were dumped onto the ground in a heap. The soldiers, perhaps smoking tobacco to mask the stench, sat cross-legged in circles, knives in hand. They began the process of flaying. Imagine peeling a fruit, but the skin is human and the fruit is bone. They made incisions along the hairline and down the back of the neck. With methodical precision, they separated the face from the skull. The skin, limp and pale, was then handed to another group of men who held bales of raw cotton. They stuffed the empty faces with straw and cotton batting, shaping them, molding them, sewing the eyelids shut and stitching the lips together. They were creating effigies. They were turning the dead fathers and sons of Serbia into taxidermy trophies. The intention was to preserve the identity of the rebels so they could be presented to the Sultan in Istanbul as recognizable proof of victory. The skins were packed into bundles, soft and yielding, but the skulls, the hard, white, stripped foundations of those men, were cast aside into a separate pile, a growing mountain of calcium that gleamed under the Balkan sun. It was this pile of discarded bone that gave Hurshid Pasha his darkest idea. Why bury them? Why hide the cost of rebellion? Why not use them as bricks? While the white bones were left to bleach in the dust of Niš, the faces of the dead began a strange and silent journey. The cotton-stuffed skins, now dry and resembling grotesque puppets, were carefully packed into saddlebags and wooden crates. They were treated not as remains, but as diplomatic correspondence. The couriers rode hard, following the imperial road that connected the Balkans to the heart of the empire. They passed through villages where life continued as normal, past markets selling spices and silks, carrying with them the hollowed-out visages of the men who had died for freedom. It is a surreal image to contemplate, a caravan of the dead, riding swiftly toward the Bosphorus, their unseeing eyes bumping against the leather of the saddlebags with every stride of the horses. Upon arrival in Istanbul, this macabre cargo was not hidden away in a dungeon. It was presented with the pomp and circumstance of a state victory. The crates were opened in the shadow of the Topkapi Palace, amidst the scent of blooming tulips and the salt spray of the sea. The Sultan, Mahmud II, did not recoil in horror. He inspected the work. He saw the familiar mustaches, the battle scars, the features of the men who had dared to defy his will. These were not just trophies. They were proof that order had been restored. The skins were reportedly displayed at the palace gates, a warning to anyone who walked past the seat of power. The citizens of the capital, dressed in their finery, would look up and see the suspended faces of the Serbian rebels, swaying gently in the breeze coming off the Golden Horn. It was a collision of high culture and absolute barbarism. A reminder that the velvet of the throne room was paid for with the skin of the frontier. But back in Niš, the story was far from over. The theater of the capital had its props, but the commander Hurshid Pasha needed a more permanent statement for the provinces. The skins were perishable. They would eventually rot or be eaten by vermin. He needed stone. He needed something that would outlast the season, something that would stand for generations. He looked at the pile of skulls that remained, 952 of them, stripped of their flesh, gleaming like polished ivory. He called for the master masons. He called for the lime and the sand. He did not ask for a grave to be dug. He pointed to the road leading into the city and ordered a tower to be built. And he gave them the specific architectural blueprint. The skulls were not to be buried inside the wall. They were to be the wall. The chemistry of the tower was as brutal as its purpose. To bind the skulls together, the masons did not use simple mud. They used quicklime and sand. Quicklime, or calcium oxide, is a caustic, volatile substance. When you mix it with water to create mortar, it undergoes a violent exothermic reaction. It hisses. It boils. It releases a heat intense enough to burn human skin. I want you to imagine the irony of this material. The very substance used to cement the remains of the Serbian rebels was a substance that burned. As the masons worked under the watchful eyes of the Ottoman guards, they slaked the lime, creating a sizzling gray paste that would serve as the eternal bed for the bones of their countrymen. The architecture was simple, almost utilitarian. It was a rectangular prism rising about 15 feet into the air. But the arrangement of the facade was calculated with a chilling geometric precision. The builders were instructed to place the skulls in perfectly horizontal rows, spacing them evenly like tiles in a bathroom. There were 56 rows in total, 14 on each of the 4 sides. As the walls rose, row by row, the tower began to take on its terrifying character. The masons would scoop a trowel of the burning lime mortar, slap it onto the stone core, and then press a skull into the wet mixture. They had to be careful. The skulls had to be oriented outward. The empty eye sockets had to face the road. The teeth had to grin at the passers-by. It is said that some of the builders were local Serbs, forced into labor by the occupying army. Imagine the psychological torture of that task. Picking up a skull from the pile, feeling the smooth curve of the parietal bone, the sharp edge of the cheekbone. Perhaps recognizing a dental pattern or a healed scar on the forehead that belonged to a neighbor, a cousin, or a friend. And then, being forced to shove that familiar face into the wet mortar, locking it into a prison of stone forever. The lime would harden around the bone, gripping it tight, bleaching it whiter over time. The flesh was gone, sent to Istanbul, but the structure remained. By the time the final row was laid at the top, 952 sentinels were in place. The tower stood white and terrible against the green fields of Niš, a silent choir that did not sing, but screamed a warning to anyone who dared to look up. It was no longer just a pile of bones. It was a monolith, a unified structure of calcium and hate that declared without a single word that the empire was eternal, and resistance was dust. But Hurshid Pasha made a critical miscalculation. He understood the mechanics of terror, but he underestimated the physics of grief. He believed that the sight of the rotting skulls would paralyze the Serbian population, that it would drive them into a state of permanent submission. He forgot that to a mother, those were not bricks in a wall. They were sons. They were husbands who had once sat at the dinner table. And so a second secret war began. It was not fought with cannons or muskets in the light of day. It was fought with chisels and whispers under the cover of the darkest nights. In the years that followed the construction of the tower, strange shadows began to move across the fields of Niš. They appeared only when the moon was hidden behind the clouds, when the Ottoman sentries were nodding off at their posts. These were the women of Serbia. They came wrapped in heavy wool shawls, moving with the silent grace of ghosts. They did not come to destroy the tower. They came to dismantle it, one piece at a time. Imagine the terrifying intimacy of that act. A woman standing in the pitch black, running her hands over the rough surface of the wall, feeling for the familiar shape of a brow or a jawline she had kissed 1,000 times. The work was agonizingly slow. The mortar, a mixture of lime and sand, had hardened into a substance as tough as concrete. They used small iron picks, kitchen knives, or sometimes just their bare fingernails, scratching away at the binding agent. Chip, chip, chip. The sound had to be masked by the wind. One slip of the hand, one loud noise, and the guards would descend. But they persisted. When a skull was finally loosened, when the grip of the empire was broken, they would pull it free with a reverence that defies description. They would wrap the bone in a cloth, cradle it against their chest like a newborn infant, and vanish back into the darkness. They took them home. They buried them in the consecrated ground of village cemeteries or beneath the floorboards of their houses, whispering the funeral rites that had been denied on the battlefield. This is the reason why, if you visit the tower today, you will not see 952 skulls. You will see less than 60. The missing hundreds were not lost to the elements or the erosion of time. They were reclaimed. they were stolen back by the enduring power of memory. The tower, intended to be a symbol of Ottoman dominance, was slowly transformed into a testament to Serbian defiance. It became a honeycomb of empty sockets, each missing skull a small victory of love over tyranny. The Pasha had built a wall of fear, but the people of Niš turned it into a sieve. Time moved forward, indifferent to the silent screaming of the tower. The flesh decayed, the empire began its slow decline, and the story of Cegar drifted from memory into legend. By the 1830s, the Skull Tower had become a strange curiosity on the road to Istanbul, a grim landmark for travelers making the grand tour of the East. In 1833, one such traveler arrived, a man whose voice would carry the story of Niš to the salons of Paris and the libraries of London. His name was Alphonse de Lamartine. He was a French poet, a politician, and a romantic soul who sought the exotic mysteries of the Orient. What he found instead was a mirror reflecting the darkest capabilities of man. Lamartine was riding across the plain on a sweltering afternoon. The sun was high, bleaching the color from the landscape. Up ahead, shimmering in the heat haze, he saw a white column rising from the grass. To his cultured European eye, it appeared to be a triumphal obelisk, perhaps a remnant of Roman antiquity made of marble or white stone. It had a strange, textured surface that caught the light in complex ways. Intrigued, he spurred his horse forward, expecting to find an inscription or a classical relief. He dismounted in the shadow of the structure and walked closer, raising his hand to touch the cool white stone. But as his eyes adjusted to the glare, the illusion shattered. The marble resolved into the jagged sutures of cranial bone. The texture became the hollow stare of hundreds of eye sockets. He realized with a jolt of nausea that he was standing before a pyramid of human remains, cemented together by the hands of their enemies. He saw the hair still clinging to some of the skulls, swaying in the dry wind. He saw the marks of the sabers and the holes of the musket balls. It was a confrontation between the refined sensibilities of Western civilization and the raw, brutal reality of the Balkan frontier. The local Turkish governors, perhaps sensing his disgust, or perhaps feeling a twinge of shame under the gaze of a European dignitary, suggested that the tower might be demolished to avoid offending his delicate nature. Lamartine's response was immediate and fierce. He did not ask for the tower to be hidden. He did not ask for the evidence to be buried. He understood that this structure, as horrific as it was, possessed a moral power that far exceeded any marble statue. In his travelogue, Voyage en Orient, he wrote the words that would save the tower from destruction. He said, "Let them leave this monument. Let them leave it as it is. It will teach their children what the independence of a people costs." He saw that the Ottomans had built a monument to their own cruelty, but in doing so, they had inadvertently built a Serbian liberty. Because of his intervention, the tower remained. It ceased to be a weapon of intimidation and became a lesson in history. The skulls were no longer just the heads of rebels. They were the professors of a terrible curriculum, teaching every generation that freedom is not free. It is bought with the calcium of the brave. The empire did crumble, just as the mortar eventually began to crack. The borders shifted, the uniforms changed, and the roar of the cannons was replaced by the hum of modern traffic. But the lesson that Lamartine spoke of remained, to preserve it from the elements, and perhaps to shield the modern world from the raw intensity of the past. A structure was built around the structure. In 1892, a chapel was constructed to enclose the tower. It is a strange architectural embrace, a church built not to house a saint, but to house a crime scene. The roof protects the calcium from the acid rain, and the walls muffle the noise of the city, turning the monument into a sanctuary of silence. Walking into the chapel of the Skull Tower today is a disorienting experience. You leave the bright, noisy streets of Niš and step into a cool, hushed twilight. The air smells of beeswax candles and old stone. And there it stands in the center of the room. It is smaller now, diminished by the theft of the grieving mothers and the ravages of time. It stands less than 10 feet tall, a stump of its former glory. But the power of it has not faded. If anything, the silence of the chapel amplifies it. The 58 remaining skulls stare out from the wall, their hollow eyes following you as you move. They are no longer screaming warnings to a conquered population. They are asking questions of the living. But there is one skull that demands your attention above all others. It does not sit in the wall. It has been removed, separated from the rank and file, and placed in a special display. It rests on a velvet cushion inside a glass case, illuminated by a soft light, like a crown jewel or a holy relic. This is the skull of Stevan Sinđelić, the man who pulled the trigger, the man who chose fire over submission, the commander of Resava. Examining it closely through the glass, you are struck by the profound stillness of the object. It is just bone, yellowed, brittle, laced with fine cracks that map the trauma of that final explosion. There is no skin to show the sweat of his brow. There are no muscles to show the trembling of his jaw as he watched the enemy approach. There is only the hard, enduring architecture of his mind. Seeing him there, isolated behind the glass, you have to wonder if he ever found peace. In life, he was the commander who stood alone against the decision of death. In death, he is still alone, separated from his men by the museum display. He has become a symbol, stripped of his humanity just as surely as the Ottomans stripped him of his flesh. Yet in that silence, looking at the jagged sutures of his cranium, you can almost feel the heat of the match he held in his hand. He is quiet now, but his silence is louder than the gunpowder that killed him. There is a legend in Niš, whispered by the old women who light candles in the chapel, about the wind. They say that before the chapel was built, when the tower stood naked against the elements, the wind did not just blow past it, it played it. The laws of acoustics suggest this is possible. You have a structure riddled with hundreds of hollow chambers, the sinus cavities, the nasal passages, the empty orbits of the eyes. When the Kosovo wind blew down from the Carpathian Mountains, hitting the face of the tower at the right angle, the skulls would begin to sing. It was not a melody, it was a dissonance, a low, mournful whistling that sounded like 1,000 flutes played by breathless musicians. Some travelers described it as a scream frozen in time. Others heard it as a lullaby for the dead. Science tells us it is merely the friction of air moving through calcium tunnels. But if you stand there long enough, in the silence of the chapel, watching the flickering candlelight dance across the brows of the 58 survivors, it is hard to rely on physics alone. You begin to wonder if the sound was the collective voice of the army, trying to finish the sentence that was interrupted by the gunpowder. They are trying to tell us that they are still here. They are trying to tell us that a man is more than the sum of his bones. But the most haunting sound in the Skull Tower is not the wind. It is the silence. It is the heavy, expectant silence of the empty spaces in the wall. Every missing skull represents a story that was stolen back by love. Every gap in the mortar is a scar where a mother refused to let the empire win. And the skulls that remain? They are the ones who had no one to come for them. They are the orphans of the battlefield, left to hold the line for eternity. They are waiting, not for a rescue, for that time has passed. They are waiting for a witness, and that witness is you. We have walked through the mud of the trench. We have smelled the sulfur and the burning lime. We have seen the price tag of 25 piastres placed on a human life. Now, you stand before the glass case of Stevan Sinđelić and the wall of his men. You must render a verdict. History is often written by the victors, but this monument was built by the victors to shame the losers. And in doing so, they accidentally built a cathedral to courage. Was Sinđelić a hero who liberated his people from the fear of death? Or was he a desperate captain who took 3,000 lives without asking? Look into the hollow eyes of the tower one last time. They do not judge you. They simply ask you not to look away. In a world that is addicted to comfort, they remind us that the ground we walk on was often purchased with blood. They remind us that freedom is a fragile thing, easily broken, and incredibly expensive to repair. The oath of the Skull Tower is simple. Do not let them be just a tourist attraction. Do not let them be just a scary story for a dark night. Carry their memory with you. Because as long as we remember the cost of their sacrifice, the mortar will never truly harden, and the wind will never truly stop singing. This has been the story of the Skull Tower of Niš, a story of how an empire tried to build a wall of fear and instead built a monument to the unbreakable human spirit. If this journey into the dark corners of history has moved you, do not keep it to yourself. Share this story. Become the voice for the 58 skulls that can no longer speak. Until next time, keep your eyes open, for history is hiding in the shadows, waiting to be found.